Hello, I'm Rebecca Harper.
And I'm David Holloway.
Thanks for listening to Phishing for Trouble from ISMS.online.
In November 2014, Sony Pictures was about to release a satirical movie depicting the fictional assassination of North Korea's leader.
North Korea, as you can imagine, did not like that at all. It's very hard to overstate quite how seriously North Korea takes the image and the status of its leader, Kim Jong-un, who is seen as almost like a god. It's not an ideal analogy, but that's probably the closest you can get.
A month before the release of the Seth Rogen movie, The Interview, Sony executives were issued a mysterious warning message. On the following Monday, employees' computers were made inoperable by malware. Sony later learned that the hack had exposed vast amounts of sensitive information, from personal confidential data to private emails and even unreleased films. Jeff White is an author and investigative journalist. His specialist topic is organised crime and technology, and he's behind the hit podcast The Lazarus Heist, which explores the Sony case.
It was horrific what happened to Sony. They also stole a whole bunch of very sensitive email data from inside Sony, thousands and thousands of emails, which they then started leaking very selectively through the media. They would leak emails, but they would also contact journalists and say, in the latest leak of data, you will find X, Y, and Z. You should write a story about that. And what was interesting and fascinating about the case was that each leak of data was bigger and more impactful than the last. They were actually staging the releases of data, building up to the point where they released data from the chief executive and chairman of Sony, which was going to be the coup de grace. It was going to be the killer blow. This is some of the most powerful people in Hollywood, and their personal emails, very indiscreet emails, were spilled all over the internet. It took Sony a long time to recover from that, and the fallout has been extremely damaging.
This may have been 10 years ago, but the same methods of infiltrating an organisation to create complete disorder are still viable today. Why? Because human nature leaves us vulnerable to social engineering. So much of our lives are lived online these days, attackers have plenty of ways to access our information.
They weren't targeting the cast and crew via their official Sony Pictures email addresses. They were sending messages via Facebook, and it would be things like, click here for photos of nude celebrities, which again sounds kind of lame, but actually at that time, there'd been a huge leak of nude celebrities' photographs, a thing called the fappening. It's a horrible name, but that had actually happened. And so the hackers were piggybacking off of that and saying, well, hey, here's more nude photographs you might be tempted to click on. They were also targeting, though, Sony's corporate infrastructure, and they were targeting employees within Sony. And the way they ended up getting inside the company, we believe, was by sending a phishing email to an employee in a London office of Sony, and it had an attachment on it saying, here are those video files that you asked for. There was all sorts of other tricks they were trying to pull in terms of sending CVs in, pretending to be a job hunter. There were multiple attempts. Sony has thousands of employees. The hackers had thousands of opportunities to try and get in, and thousands of different ways of phrasing those phishing emails. So for the person in marketing, here's those video files you asked for. Click here to download them. For the person in HR, here's my CV. Would you hire me? Please open it. For the stars and crew of the film, well, here's some salacious pictures of your colleagues and buddies. Do you want to click on them? So it's not just you've got thousands of chances with employees. You've got thousands of different ways of using those chances on different employees. What happened was somebody at Sony fell for it, the hackers got inside, they started destroying bits of Sony's infrastructure. I think it was about 8,000 Sony computers got taken offline. The company was reduced to effectively paper and pen. At one point, apparently, they had a person sitting at a table in the car park whose job it was to write checks, physical checks, for people's salaries. So people would go up and say, well, my monthly salary is X, and they'd write them out a check for that.
Jeff's been covering technology for a long time and has seen plenty of changes. His latest book looks at how hacking gangs launder money through things like Bitcoin or social media. More generally, though, he's interested in how criminals can work collaboratively in online spaces.
The reason I find organised crime quite interesting is that, well, the clue's in the question. It's organised. It's a set of criminals who are organising together. There are lots of crimes in the world, horrible murders and all this other stuff, that's not very well organised. It's just crime. So what you have to do as an organised criminal network is somehow trust each other And the people that you're working with, by the way, are innately distrustworthy. These are criminals you're working with at the end of the day. But you've got to somehow trust them enough for you all to come together and perpetrate this criminal enterprise.
Now, tech may do wonderful things for our lives and society, but are the tech companies themselves thinking enough about all the ways their products can be used?
I worry that technology companies generally, the technology industry, has this sort of very, very rosy view of what it will do in society. And that's because you're battling with technology to sort of launch these products, you're battling to make the code work. And what's motivating that is this belief that the world will be better. What they don't often think is how people will abuse that technology. More technology companies, more technologists need to have a handle on the dark side of this and just need to think about the dark side a bit more often than they do.
Today, we're talking in depth about social engineering. It's how hackers got into Sony. It's one of the most common ways for cyber attackers to get into a business. So why does it still work?
It's remarkable. It's 2024 and still, time and time again, when you look at major hacks in which businesses have lost literally millions of dollars worth of funds and millions of pounds of funds, or gigabytes of personal, very sensitive personal data about people, so often the way in is through social engineering. Trying to target the technology as it's getting more and more secure rapidly is a lot harder than targeting human beings who probably think the same thing today about security as they did 2 years ago and have the same sort of posture to it. So again, you're tracking a bit more of a moving target with technology, whereas with people, you're able to target them.
There is so much to cover before we meet the rest of our experts today. But we'll try to make this simple with a few explainers. Let's start with the terminology, Becca. Social engineering. What's that?
So social engineering is a manipulation tactic that attackers use to trick individuals into divulging confidential information or performing actions that compromise security. I think Jessica Barker puts it really nicely. Social engineering preys on human trust. Attackers exploit how people behave naturally, trusting others, wanting to be helpful, or fearing consequences to gain access to sensitive systems or data.
Exactly that. It's using really well-established psychological techniques to prey on fear or trust or urgency or all these things to make someone do something that you want them to do, basically. Now, there are a number of phrases and a lot of terminology attached to this. Of course, phishing for trouble is part of that. Let's just go through some of the main ways in which social engineering attacks take place. So why don't we start with phishing?
Okay, so phishing is probably one of the most common types, where attackers send emails that look legitimate, attempting to trick the recipients into clicking on a malicious link or sharing credentials. Phishing emails often appear as messages from trusted sources like banks or employers.
Absolutely. So that's kind of at the top level. We then have spear phishing. So this is essentially exactly the same as phishing that Becca just explained, but this is targeting specific companies, sometimes individuals within companies that might be high target. But then we go one level down from that. So whaling, okay? So this is WHALING.
Yeah, so whaling, terrible term, highly targeted form of phishing, often directed at senior executives or big fish, in inverted commas. So attackers, again, will impersonate trusted individuals or entities and use really sophisticated methods to convince executives to transfer funds or share privileged information.
So another one that we've covered off before in previous episodes, so Vishing. So essentially, Vishing follows exactly the same approach, but it's done over the phone. So this is kind of voice phishing, if you like, Vishing. And then, of course, you have quishing.
It sounds mad. It's not made up, we promise. So this is where attackers use QR codes to trick people into scanning them, which then leads to malicious websites or prompts them to download malware. QR codes are increasingly common in everyday life. Just think about going to a car park. You often have to scan a QR code to pay to park your car or something like that. So it is a new avenue, but equally as horrible to experience as a user if you accidentally scan a a QR code that's malicious.
So those are some of the main ones. There are others as well, but that pretty much covers off most of the things that we'll go into in this episode.
If the start of our episode has left you afraid to open your emails, then don't worry. We're going to spend the rest of our time making sure you're clued up on how hackers might approach you and what we as individuals and businesses can do about it. You met Javad Malik earlier in the series. Here's some simple advice he had for anyone faced with the daily annoyance of phishing and vishing communications.
I'd go back to the fundamental principles is like, are you expecting this communication? Are they asking you to do something that you don't normally do? And is there a sense of urgency? And I think if you bear those in mind, then even if it is your grandmother calling saying that they've been arrested in Ibiza and they need you to send bail money, you know that maybe I should ask them myself or find another avenue to contact them to verify that this is the case. I always say never feel guilty about just hanging up on someone. Just hit the close button. You know, you pick it up. Oh, hello, sir. How are you doing? I'm calling from the tax office. Just hang up. You don't need to engage with them. And then just in your phone, you can normally report and block it.
So true. It feels so rude to just hang up on someone. But if you're genuinely not sure, you can always contact them through their official channels. Let's talk more about the human side of all this now. Keith Martin is a professor of information security at Royal Holloway University in London. Now, Becca, you might not know, but that is where I went to university. And yes, my name is David Holloway. Now, Keith Martin says that cybersecurity isn't just about tech, and we're only starting to acknowledge how important the psychology and social context is.
I tend to think of cybersecurity as sort of having three layers, and the outer layer is a sort of people, society, organizational layer, and that's something I think people maybe didn't appreciate as much in the past, but in the end, everything we do digitally is really for people. It's people trying to do things, and the technology is just the carrier, if you like. So I think there's a human part, and then within that, there's the technology part, the bit that is traditionally seen as cyber security, you know, the computers, networks, firewalls, all this kind of stuff. But they themselves, of course, have got to be built from fundamental components, and cryptography really provides the toolkit of what we often call security services, things like confidentiality, keeping secrets, or data integrity, making sure stuff hasn't been changed in ways we haven't expected, or authentication. Human psychology really does make us open to all sorts of troubles, if you like, because we are individuals, we're human beings, we're not rational objects.
So why does social engineering work so well, even when we're aware of how prolific it is? Remember Dr. Jessica Barker from episode 4?
I've been working on the human side of cybersecurity for the last 13 years or so. My work focuses on cybersecurity awareness, behavior, and culture. In cybersecurity, we have focused much more on the technology. So to some extent, I think we have a responsibility where we have left people more vulnerable. And so what we're finding is that attackers are exploiting that, and we need to help people understand where they may be targeted, where they may be caught up in cybercrime, and what they can do to help themselves stay safe, in turn helping organizations stay safe.
Even if you consider yourself the world's most uninteresting human, don't assume you're not a target. Hacking groups are targeting people because of who they are or the organization they are part of.
I find often we underestimate the extent to which cyber criminals will do their research and their reconnaissance. So an attack really starts with a often criminal group, often financially motivated, not always, but often, and they will do their research on usually multiple organizations. It's rare they'll have just one target in mind, but they may be targeting a specific sector, for example. And they will do research just like any of us does research online, search engines, using social media, putting together a picture of the profile of an organization, working out who is in which roles, using the website of the organization themselves. And of course, we live in a time where many of us do share a lot on social media. If somebody is in a high-profile role in an organization, they will often do interviews in the press. They will often be recorded in videos. And this is great for a public profile, great from a business perspective, but cyber criminals are able to use this information that we put out there to their own advantage. And this isn't necessarily about them going one by one, very manually gathering this information. They're using automated tools, they're using AI, they're using coding to be able to gather troves of information, and that can include video, that can include audio, to clone people in deepfake attacks. And when it comes to a deepfake voice clone, we have been able to mimic people's voices with their consent using just a few seconds. 7 seconds of audio, and you can very realistically clone somebody's voice. And it might not be perfect in terms of the cadence, it might not be perfect in terms of the words chosen, but combine that with social engineering, with that manipulation using fear, urgency, authority bias, then it can be very powerful.
Jeff says these organised groups make up a whole hidden industry.
There's an entire industry of what's called initial access brokers, IABs, whose job it is their full-time job to analyze a target company, a victim company or victim organization, institution, work out who works there, who's got access to the money, who's got access to personal data on customers, who are the owners of those bits of the business, scope those people out, find them on LinkedIn, try and dupe them into giving away their passwords, send them phishing emails, try and contact them through social media platforms, try and trick them to giving out money. It is a full-time surveillance business. And those initial access brokers, once they get a hook into a company, once they get the password for the head of finance, chief financial officer, chief marketing officer, something like that, they sell it. And they will sell that information within hours. You know, as soon as they get a good lead and say, wow, I've got this company and I've managed to get all their passwords, they sell it on. And those passwords are used then to do things like ransomware, to do things like data exfiltration, do things like extortion on companies, expose the company to fraud. So you've got this full-time network of people who are just constantly scanning potential targets. And I don't know whether the people who are in these organizations really understand that that's the game. It's basically, you're almost constantly being surveilled and trawled to see if there's a way in. And that access, as I say, is sold on afterwards.
Even if an individual is just the accidental gateway into a business's wider security, the personal nature of cyber attacks and social engineering tricks can leave people with lasting psychological impacts too.
One thing we don't talk about enough, I think, in the cybersecurity field is the psychological impact of attacks. And there's layers to this. One layer is the team in an organization responding to an attack, working really long days, often working with perhaps incomplete information, trying to put a picture together and being under a lot of pressure to respond to questions, and not necessarily having the control that you would like to have in that kind of situation. So it certainly can be a recipe for burnout. So taking care of those individuals who really are on the front line of responding to an attack, I think, is crucial. And then for individuals who become a victim of social engineering, the research shows us that can have a profound impact in terms of an emotional or psychological response, depending on the attack. So something like romance fraud, which is, of course, very emotional, very manipulative, abusive attack, research has shown that the impact on a person of that can be equivalent to PTSD. Victims of romance fraud can describe it as almost like grief, like a loss. And if you're a victim of a phishing email in an organization, there is also a psychological impact there. And the research shows that how the organization responds to that individual is crucial in their recovery, if you like. Because when somebody clicks on a link, say in a phishing email, causes an incident, then that person, research shows, generally will feel an internal sense of shame. If they are dealt with using empathy, if the response from the organization is supportive, then that person is likely to feel more loyalty and to be more productive and to stay in that organization for longer. If the organization shames and blames them, the research shows that a year later, they're far more likely to have left that role. The main thing for me, the main lesson is the importance of empathy and of recognizing we're all human. We can all make mistakes. We can all have a busy day, a stressed day. But by raising awareness and by building the systems, the layers of controls in such a way, we can support and enable people to be stronger and more secure online.
Jeff has spoken to plenty of organisations about the impact attacks can have on individuals who are phished or duped.
In some cases, the individuals decided to quit, resign, move elsewhere, so there's immediate impact on that individual. For the people whose data is stolen as well, whether this is customers or employees, there's this ongoing sense of, well, how much have they got? And okay, they may have leaked my email address, but is that all they've got? Or have they got my passwords? They have my national insurance number, my bank details, and so on. So there's this sort of pervasive, corrosive issue. And also, personal data is like kryptonite. It hangs around for a long time. Yes, you can replace things like your email address. You can maybe change your password, but things like your national insurance number, bank account details, your address. You don't really want to move house every time there's been a hack. So the consequences for people can be quite serious.
If we can't keep up with crime in technology today, how are we going to adapt to tech that's emerging in the future? Keith says there are more questions to be answered.
Yeah, it's a moving target. We've got new technologies coming out, and some of them are quite game-changing in the way they're going to affect things. So yes, for example, we've got AI at the moment causing lots of furore. We'll also, I imagine, in the future see much more technology embedded in human bodies, and we're going to have to make sense of that. Obviously, Elon Musk's worlds of computer chips in your brain, goodness knows where that's going. AI is creating all sorts of challenges, but there are also very different types of AI, and I think the one that most people are seeing at the moment is generative AI, which can appear to be human. And it is in one sense, because it's more like a sort of parrot that's replaying what humans have already said. So it's not human in any way, it's just gathering human outputs from the past and assimilating them.
So with reports of AI deepfakes being used in crime, what happens when this gets used for social engineering on a regular basis? Should I be afraid of picking up the phone or being photographed?
I wouldn't say people should worry about AI, but I would say that it's important that people remain aware of how the threat is evolving in terms of AI. I would say that AI-enabled social engineering, it's still minimal compared to more traditional phishing over email, over text, over social media and the phone. But we are seeing more and more cases using deepfake technology, particularly voice cloning. There have been cases of deepfake in video. So the very famous case that hit the headlines was the Hong Kong company, where a finance worker was on a video conferencing call with many people, and throughout the course of that call was convinced to transfer, I think it was the equivalent of $25 million, and discovered afterwards that that was all a deep fake. The finance worker was the only real person on that video conferencing call. Everybody else was a deep fake of, the chief financial officer and other people in authority. So that's one very famous example of a video deep fake. But what I am seeing and hearing much more is voice deep fake calls. Again, it's the CEO fraud, but using deep fake. So posing as the CEO or the CFO on a phone call, the voice being extremely convincing and sounding exactly like the executive and convincing the individual to transfer sums of money. Having our team at Sygenta, we have made deepfakes, some of which are public and some for clients. And particularly voice cloning is very easy. And this has changed dramatically in just a year or two. So deepfakes are now much easier to make, and people perhaps aren't expecting that as much. So combining deepfake technology with social engineering tactics is very powerful in terms of manipulation. So the important thing is that we raise awareness of this, help people understand the current state of play in terms of AI technology, but not to the point where we terrify people, to the point where we can help them identify the attacks and be better protected, but not to the point where they feel terrified and undermined.
I do feel quite terrified by that story nonetheless. So let's look at some simple steps we can all take to increase the chance of stopping a hack in its tracks.
Multi-factor authentication is probably one of the best controls you can have to secure your accounts. I don't think there's anything quite as good for the end user. And what it is that a simple ID and password can be guessed, or if you reuse it, if it's been stolen in another attack, they'll reuse the same credentials on all your... So say like you do some shopping at catfood.com or whatever, and that small website gets breached. And now criminals have everyone's username and password. Now, if you're using that same username and password, which a lot of people do, or some small variation of it, they'll try that username and password against every single one of the accounts. So there are tools for this. They'll automate it. They'll try every bank. They'll try every like financial PayPal or what have you. They'll try your Facebook account. They'll try all sorts of things. And they'll try to get in. If you have multi-factor authentication, that simply having the ID and the password isn't enough to get in. So when you log in, it will ask you for a second factor or a second channel, something like that. At the most basic level, a website will send you a text message on your phone and say, like, here's a code, put that code in. Other ones are more sophisticated. So a lot of it comes down to just having layers of control. So you have the encryption to protect against certain types of attacks, but it won't protect you against all types of attacks. Your MFA will protect you against some types of attacks against your account, but it won't protect you against all types of attacks. And this is why we speak about security almost like being an onion, with layer upon layer of security and having that defense in depth. So eventually something will, so you make it hard for people to get access to your system.
Keith says that studying cybersecurity and carrying out research into how technology integrates with society can help us think about how to build security into systems.
Traditionally, if you look at security from a purely technical point of view, it's a rather cold metallic object, which just consists of widgets and gadgets talking to one another, and cryptography, of course, doing its thing. But actually, security in practice, as it's actually conducted in organizations or in family homes, can be quite different. And I think you've got to understand what that looks like. And so there is quite a body of academic research, including colleagues at Royal Holloway, who get involved, for example, in ethnographic work, where they're actually going in and studying security in a particular context. And one of my colleagues at the moment has just come back from Kenya, where she was basically looking at security of protest movements, for example. So how security in technology and security of technologies is used and relates to how the individuals involved in a stressful circumstance are trying to navigate their way through life. And that's a bit of cybersecurity now, as much as it is about physical security, because people are relying totally on these digital technologies in these situations. So I think it's understanding what it's like on the ground. And again, that's not the cold, distant view of, this is a technology, now off you go and use it. This is actually going, what does that feel like when you actually use it? Or how are people using it?
Jeff has some more practical tips for how you can use tech to protect your business.
There's loads of technology that you can put in place, and loads of sort of technological frameworks that you can think of. One of the ones that's very popular at the moment is zero trust, which is the idea that once somebody enters one password, they shouldn't just be able to waltz everywhere in your computer network. You should seal off bits of the network, which is really, really valuable. I mean, if a hacker breaks in and manages to get into one bit of your organization, they shouldn't be able to roam freely ad infinitum through the rest of it. It's that idea of, it's like on ships where they have sections of the ship, and if one bit gets flooded, it doesn't flood the whole ship. It's a very similar sort of process. I think also organizations need to work out where their most valuable data is. And when it comes to valuableness of data, value of data, think of that in the round, because I'm sure someone in the finance department would think, well, if we have credit card data, that must be the valuable data. But actually, from a PR point of view, your valuable data might be the very controversial plan that you're working on, that you're still working on, that might or might not work. And if that leaks out in public, that might be an absolute killer. So again, in terms of working out where the value is in your organization, think of where that value is. Ask lots of people what they think is valuable. Think about it from a PR point of view. Think about it from a finance point of view, from reporting, regulation, all that kind of thing. And start looking at where those stores of data are and how they're protected and who's got access to them. And keep cleaning up after yourself. Don't leave data hanging about. Don't leave passwords hanging about. Think about your joiners, movers, leavers policy. Make sure that if somebody leaves, their password gets revoked. Just keep tidying up. The less data you have hanging around, the less there is for hackers to get their hands on. Anything you can do, that kind of little but often approach, anything you can do just to lift yourself up a little bit higher, you're less low-hanging fruit and you're less likely to get hit, or at least hit catastrophically as another organization in the queue.
Some really great points there. But what if you're a small business and your people are really stretched for time? Don't worry. Keith says cultural change is a vital investment and thinks it's easier to bring about big changes when you have a smaller staff.
Someone can actually get to grips with this security culture element because, in fact, there's a limited number of employees. You can actually set the tone. You can lead from the top. You can show that it's taken seriously. You can reward people rather than punish people. It's actually a lot easier to roll something like that out. So it's probably equipping people with the basics, of which there are many resources, but I think actually really developing this idea of the positive security culture for a small organization is really vital, because then half your problems go away if everybody's on board. I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not trying to say that's just a straightforward thing to do, but there's a lot of guidelines. There's a lot of, NCSC, National Cybersecurity Centre, have certain guidelines which people can follow. But I think there's a lot of good practice that people should consider, and people are being sharing their other experiences. But I think the organisation can do a lot. You could argue in the end, the individuals in the organisation, it's not really their job. In fact, if this is all done constructively within the organisation, then it should just become a very natural thing.
Tech is always changing. So instead of just relying on software tools to protect us from attacks, Jess says we need to develop an anti-scam mindset.
For too long, I think our advice when it came to phishing, when it came to social engineering, was too tactical. We would tell people very focused on phishing emails, things like hover over the link, if it's a link in there, to see if it really is sending you to the destination you expect, look at the sender's address. We would give people more technical, tactical techniques to identify social engineering. And I've long thought this was a mistake, and that instead we can take a more strategic approach and really encourage people to develop an anti-scam mindset. Because often the most powerful social engineering, the social engineering that really works on us, will be taking advantage of our mindset. So instead, it's about identifying how a communication makes you feel and looking for communications that are unexpected, that make you feel something and that ask you to do something. So if something comes in and it is coming from the boss, and the boss doesn't usually send you communications or give you a phone call, and they're using urgency, they are using flattery, they're using sympathy, if it's making you feel worried or hurried or stressed, and then it's asking you to do something that, again, you wouldn't ordinarily do, transfer a large sum of money without going through the due process, for example, that's the time to verify via another means.
So what can the security industry do to help us out, besides providing tools?
The security industry needs to get better at providing tools that are unintrusive, that reduce the friction while increasing security. The example I often give is that of ABS in cars. When they introduced ABS, there was no difference to the driver. You still drove the car in exactly the same way. And you hit the brakes in exactly the same way. And when ABS needs to kick in, it kicked in. And it stopped you from losing control and skidding into a tree or something. And we need to think about designing security more like ABS, so that it's not introducing as much friction, so that people are annoyed. Because I think that's a responsibility on us as an industry to make it easier for people to securely do the right thing.
Javad says organisations need to commit to creating behaviour change by engaging differently with their people.
What organisations should do is, I think one place where they should start is the security team should work to build good relations with their colleagues across the organisation. So rather than just putting up posters or saying, here's 20 modules that you have to complete and there's a quiz at the end of them, and now you'll be a security expert. Rather than doing that, they should start off with okay, this is what we do to protect the organization, and this is what we need your help with to protect the organization. And this is why it's important. And this is why we can't just simply buy a box to put in or download some software that will sort this out.
What's more, following up on reported incidents can make a big difference to engaging staff with security.
If someone reports something, the worst thing you can do is just that report goes into a black hole and you don't know, did I stop World War III? Or was that just a marketing email that I thought was a malicious email? So always close the loop with people and say like, hey, thank you so much for reporting this. You help keep our company secure. And that has a knock-on effect because we make it more sociable. You can send out things like, there's lots of things that companies do, like have leaderboards that so-and-so reported so many incidents this year, and because of them, the organization is more secure. So what you do, you collectively build a culture where doing the right thing is seen as doing the cool thing or the right, it's brilliant.
Jeff agrees that the biggest positive impact businesses can have on their security and compliance is via their people.
Good companies are putting a lot of effort and time into targeting employees and trying to change the culture, change the behavior. The reason that struggles to get traction, and the reason we haven't sort of cracked that yet, is because, frankly, in the industry, there are loads of companies who pump out software and bits of kit with flashing lights that they sell and then they maintain for tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of pounds a year that makes them their money. Monetizing the employee awareness path and journey is a lot harder to quantify than we sold this company X bits of software and X bits of kit, and now we make X amount of money per year. That you can put on a spreadsheet, and for the next 5 years, they're going to be buying your kit, buying your software, and you're going to be able to bill them for the extra support. It's harder to put the employee education stuff on a spreadsheet. It's harder to quantify the impact of it and the effect of it, but it's also a lot harder to sort of set up a business that kind of has those metrics.
So how do you engage busy staff and make sure they know how to use the tools you give them?
I find targeted training is very powerful in an organization. People are more responsive to training that is reflective of their day-to-day, that incorporates use cases that they can relate to, where they feel like they are seen and heard in that training. Using engaging training that is more likely to make people sit up and pay attention, not just theoretical, but using case studies, using demonstrations, helping people really understand the reality of cybercrime. I also love champion programs in organizations, and when they are built in a way that is sustainable and realistic in an organization, they can really help scale up awareness, behavior, and cultural change. So essentially having people throughout an organization who aren't necessarily technical, but have good communication skills, are in different roles, in different teams, and the security team can draw on that network, not just to share information, but also to hear back where guidance might be lacking, where there might be blockers. I think it's very powerful to share awareness raising that is aimed at personal and family security, something that so many people care about. This can be a great way of showing as a security team that you care about everybody in the organization, and it can be a great way of opening up discussions and building that kind of security mindset. And of course, drawing on hot topics like AI, something that's in the news, that's in movies, that's in books and TV programs that people are talking about, things that people are worried about, can be a great way of demystifying that and helping people see the truth from the fiction. They're helping people see, the reality versus the Hollywood version.
Thanks so much to all our brilliant guests. Social engineering is a massive topic. And whilst it's true that the technology and tactics behind cybercrime are always evolving, the biggest thing you can do to protect yourself is to engage your staff in the conversation. And it's a pretty interesting conversation after all.
Yeah, the guys have given us some great advice on practical tools and actions you can do in your organisation. But if you'd like some further support and advice, you can check out the NCSC website. You can even forward scam texts to them to report attempts. The ones, hey mum, my phone's broken. There's also a great website called Action Fraud, which we'll put a link to in the show notes.
If you'd like professional help putting compliance and cybersecurity practices into your organisation, just check out our website at ISMS.online. will help you get up to date with the ISO 27001 framework easily and without spending a fortune.
Next time on Phishing for Trouble, we'll be talking about intellectual property. Make sure you subscribe to or follow the series on your podcast app to get it.
Thanks for joining us.